All right, I'm going to talk today about chapter 20, which deals with the 1920s. Most of this lecture is going to deal with what we normally refer to as the Roaring Twenties, which is pretty much from about, say, 1920 till really till 1929, which is when you have the stock market crash. Now, having said that, if you all have been reading your book, you know that the 1920s was not all boom, but the perception at the time of the earlier 20s was a period of prosperity, and that's an image that 100 years later we still have. And so I'll just break it up in that way. Now, the thing about the 1920s is that the United States found itself in a position in 1920 that would be the same position it would find itself in 1945. In both cases, there had been world wars in which there had been massive destruction in all of the industrialized world, pretty much except for the United States. World War I was a very nasty conflict, killed over 10 million people. The United States lost a very small number of people because it didn't fight in the wars long. The United States only lost, I shouldn't say a small number of people. 160,000 people is not a small number. But, if you compare that to, say, like a country like Great Britain, which is a significantly smaller country that lost 900,000 people, or France or Germany, which lost, in the millions, each one of those countries lost in the millions. Losing 160,000 people over 2 or so years is not so bad. Now, the other thing that's significant, too, is that I said since the United States did not suffer damage within its territory, it did not suffer damage to its industrial capacity. It did not suffer damage to its agricultural capacity. This meant that when the war was over, the United States was the one major country that still was able to export goods without any diminution of its ability because it had not been affected by the war. There was still a very substantial demand for the consumer products in the United States because unlike the countries in Europe, it had not been devastated by conflict. I mean, you had a situation in many countries where the thing people wanted most of all was simply to be able to eat. And in the United States, that was not the case. Now, the other thing, too, and this is something we're going to see throughout the 20th century, and it's still going on here after we're in the third decade of the 21st century now. And this is something that's still going on. And that is a process of rapid technological development. Now, this rapid technological development resulted in something that is very much part of the world culture and very much part of American culture to this day. And that is consumerism. And this was something that really basically transformed the nature of the economy. I mean, really going back to the end of the 19th century. The American economy became increasingly dependent on individuals buying consumer goods. And this increased in the 1920s. First of all, the automobile, which had been invented in the 19th century, became increasingly common. By the time you get into the 1920s, you see a lot more paved roads, and you see increased distribution of automobiles. You see an increased distribution of gas stations. And so that means that it becomes feasible and relatively easy for people to buy automobiles. And of course, if you all watched that film that I assigned you from the first week, it's a little bit out of order, but still I think it's appropriate for what we're looking at now. That film I showed you all about the Model T, you know that due to mass production, the prices of automobiles really dropped and became very affordable for many people. Now, in addition to the automobile, you had a number of other major consumer items that came to existence that became popular during the 1920s. I mean, like, for instance, the vacuum cleaner. I mean, most people nowadays probably can't imagine having a house or an apartment without a vacuum cleaner. Back in the older days, people took rugs out the houses and beat the dirt off rugs. I mean, you can imagine it would be very, very hard to have a wall-to-wall carpet like is very common with our vacuum cleaners. Another thing that really became common too is the washing machine. Now, these early washing machines are not like the ones we have nowadays. They were basically like a tub, and then above it you'd have two rollers that where after the clothes were washed, you would put them through that to squeeze the water out. These things were pretty dangerous. I know as a kid, I remember one time we lived overseas for a while. My father was in the military, and the house that we rented had one of the old-fashioned washing machines with the rollers on it. And I know my mother told me, I was like 5 years old. She said, "Tony, don't put your finger in that." And like a lot of 5-year-old kids, the moment my mother wasn't around, I put my finger in the roller. Now, I very quickly got it out because the roller started catching my finger and started pulling my finger into it. Luckily I was able to pull my fingers out, and I didn't lose a finger or anything. But from that point on, I actually heeded my mother's advice. But I don't want to get too much off the subject. But like I said, the washing machine was a new invention. Now, there were some other inventions that were very significant too. Now, for instance, the phonograph, or record player, was not a new invention, but like the automobile, it was becoming more affordable. And so as you get into the 20s, millions of people have phonographs, and records become very common. The RCA company alone, as your book mentions, starts selling over 100 million records a year by the time you get towards the latter part of the 1920s. Now, the other invention that really makes a big difference, and is really crucial for popular culture, and really crucial for, as we're going to see when we talk about the 1930s, for political culture, is the radio. From about the mid-1920s onward, commercial radio becomes extremely popular. And as the book mentions, about 5 million families have radios by the end of the 20s. And the purchase of radios actually continues, even in the Great Depression, maybe not at the same rate. But the radio really comes to be seen as something that families need to have. And so, and as we're going to see, this becomes really important because it really allows mass information to get out. And I'll talk about this more in another lecture. The radio is really important because really for the first time in American history, and really for the first time in world history, the majority of people can hear the voices of their leaders. I mean, prior to the radio, the great majority of people in the United States never heard the voice of the president. I mean, somebody like Abraham Lincoln, for instance. I understood that he actually had a very squeaky high voice. I don't know if Abraham Lincoln would have made an impression if he had come around during the age of television or radio. But because we didn't actually hear his voice, we read what he wrote, or we read his speeches. I mean, his speeches were extremely eloquent. But nowadays, you actually hear the person, and that makes a difference. And so, radio has a major impact on people. Now, what we see during the 1920s is that the United States economy is essentially bifurcated. We have an urban economy that, by and large, is very prosperous. I mean, people are making a lot of money. People in the cities are buying these new devices, and that makes sense in the sense that cities were the first places where you really see mass electrification. Cities are the places where you see the paved roads. They come there first. They come into the rural areas later. And so it's not surprising that, the radios and the automobiles, they show up in the urban areas first. Also, movie theaters, they become another big moneymaker. And they're really important, too, because, once again, people for the first time can really see images of leaders, moving, living images of leaders. They become common because prior to the days of television, people would go to movies for pretty low prices. And before the feature came on, there would usually be a short newsreel, maybe 5 minutes, that would give you the news of the week. And people could see the president, they could see governors, senators, or whatever. And so with this technology, mass media is exposed to political leadership, and not only political leadership, but also pop culture. With the movies, you have people like, Laurel and Hardy, they come along, Buster Keaton, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the English actor. Oh, you'll see it in your book, Charlie something. I'm having a moment right now. But these actors become famous. You see people like Rudolph Valentino become a great sex symbol, and also even other people like, for instance, Josephine Baker, a lady from she grew up in a neighborhood, where the Blues play hockey now. That used to be a neighborhood. That's where Josephine Baker grew up. Josephine Baker would leave America, go to Europe, and become famous as a dancer. And one of the things that you all are looking at this week is a short film, a clip that I gave you of Josephine Baker doing the Charleston and a couple of other dances. And it's kind of one of those things that's really interesting, because it kind of lets you know that nothing's really new. I mean, if you look at some of the Josephine Baker dances, I mean, the stuff that you see on TikTok or Instagram of people twerking, or people wearing, young ladies wearing really short dresses or whatever, and letting people see what they probably wouldn't see otherwise. That's nothing new. Josephine Baker was doing that 100 years ago. And that's why, when we look at the 1920s, this is really when we start looking at American history, and it really starts looking a lot of like what we would see nowadays. I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff then that wasn't there then that is here now. But a lot of what you do see really kind of looks like what we see nowadays. But anyway, as I said before, the urban areas, you see the development coming up there more quickly. And this is where the boom times really are. Now, rural areas are actually in a pretty bad shape. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, what we see is that technology, there's a great technological explosion in the rural areas that really began towards the end of the 19th century. Now, what all this technology in rural areas means is that farming becomes ever more efficient, and farmers are able to produce more and more and more. Now, this is very significant because, like for instance, let's look at African Americans. In the year 1900, 90% of all African Americans were farmers. 90% of all African Americans lived in the South, and they lived in the country. Now, most of these African American farmers were not well-to-do people. Many of them didn't own land. They were sharecroppers, tenant farmers, agricultural workers. But what happens is that with this new technology, with tractors, with reapers, various kinds of harvesting machines, eventually you would have cotton picking machines and other kinds of machines. You don't need all the workers in the countryside anymore. You need fewer and fewer people. And so this means that smaller farmers and farm workers are pushed out of the rural areas. Now, also you have some other things going on in the South too, like for instance, like the boll weevil, which destroys southern cotton. For instance, not very far from here, over in the Missouri Boot Heel, you look at those towns over there, like say, south of Cape Girardeau down to the Arkansas border. That's the one part of rural Missouri where you see a lot of black people. And what happens is that, in the early part of the 20th century, the Boot Heel used to be all swamp, but that swamp was drained. And once it was drained, it became farming land. And so this meant that a lot of rural workers, a lot of black workers in places like Arkansas and Tennessee, as the boll weevil got bad, they moved up to the Boot Heel of Missouri, and they became farm laborers there, or they owned their farms. So places like Portageville, Hayti, Sikeston, all these towns in that part of Missouri where you have a lot of black people. And this also happened in Illinois too. I mean, if you go look in southern Illinois, from Cairo, up, further north up by Carbondale, a lot of these areas, because people don't realize, but at one time southern Illinois used to be a place where you grew cotton too. You had a lot of black workers who came to southern Illinois and came to southern Missouri and became farm workers because of the boll weevil. But the bottom line is that I kind of went into a bit of a tangent on that, but I just wanted to give you all a local example. But this is an example of how technology, it made money for the big farmers. It made money for the people who were able to invest in the machinery. But it also devastated rural communities, because that meant that people who weren't rich people who did not have the finances to invest in all the machinery, became poor. Because see, the thing about it, as production goes up, as more and more stuff is produced, prices get lower. And as prices for produce gets lower, that means that there's going to be less and less money to give the workers, which in turn squeezes workers out. And so that's one of the reasons why, like in that last film I showed you, that last chapter I showed you the films on East St. Louis, about where you have the massacre in East St. Louis in 1917 going on during World War I. You start having all of these African Americans immigrating out of the South, going to places like St. Louis, going to Chicago, going to Detroit, going to Cleveland, going to New York, going to Washington, D.C., going to Boston, or, even in the South, leaving the countryside and going to places like Memphis, going to places like Atlanta, going to places like Birmingham, in order to get jobs in industries like places like Birmingham, where they had a lot of steel mills. People went there. And so the countryside really began to empty out, and people moved into the cities. Now, also in the case of African Americans too, you had a lot of violence going on, lynchings and that sort of thing, which really pushed people out of rural areas too. And so the point I want to make here, the greater point, is that although you have the roaring 20s, you have a lot of economic activity, a lot of money being made in the cities, the countrysides were really becoming much more impoverished. They became places where you had a lot of poor, isolated rural populations, and the rich population in the countryside became progressively smaller, because only a small percentage of people could invest in these things. However, leaving the countryside really created opportunities for a lot of poor people who did not have it in the country. I mean, like, it's not an accident, for instance, that jazz music, a lot of stuff develops as people leave the countryside. Now, the place where this was most pronounced was in the community of Harlem in New York City, where you have the Harlem Renaissance, where you have a lot of writers like Countee Cullen, Claude McKay. A lot of these people, they leave the South, they leave the Caribbean, they come to New York, and they're able to become artists. They're able to get published, and all of a sudden you have this great intellectual flowering of black writers, of black thinkers in Harlem. Now, it happens in other places too, but Harlem is the biggest place. Now, we also have another interesting phenomena that really drives development in the cities. And that's that at the end of, at the very end of the 1920s, prohibition becomes a constitutional amendment. I mean, from about 1919 to 1933, it is unconstitutional to sell alcohol in the United States as a recreational beverage, as something you just drink for fun. The only drinking alcohol that was still allowed was alcohol that was served for sacramental purposes in churches. And so what this meant was that in the big cities, there became a great market for illegal liquor. Now, this has a number of different impacts on the cities. Now, first of all, organized crime, as we know it, really picks up because of the liquor market. I mean, in Illinois, for instance, the most famous gangster, of course, was Al Capone. Al Capone, he got rich off of liquor. And a matter of fact, in this area, in East St. Louis, and later on in Collinsville, Illinois, Al Capone's number one man, a fellow by the name of Buster Wertman, he was the guy who controlled alcohol sales in southern Illinois and southeastern Missouri. I mean, basically from the Illinois-Indiana border as far west as Columbia, Missouri, Buster Wertman was the distributor of alcohol for Al Capone's network. And so what we see is that in the cities, in places like Harlem, places like St. Louis, places like Chicago, nightclubs that played jazz music and where people were doing black-inspired dances like the Charleston, which was a dance that was actually developed in Charleston, South Carolina by African-American dancers. Many whites would go to these clubs and they would buy liquor. They listen to jazz music, which was, seen as, this really exciting music that, came out of the black community. And they would get this liquor. And so that's why you have the Roaring Twenties. Now, the other aspect of the Roaring Twenties that's very significant is that you have the development of young unmarried women who were known as the flappers. And, these were the young women. They had their hair cut short. They wear short dresses. They were out doing all these dancing. And the thing that's significant is that really technology changes to the point where for the first time you really have readily available birth control. In particular, you have the diaphragm that women could use. And also latex condoms become much more common. And so this means that it becomes a lot easier for unmarried women to have sex and not have to worry about having kids, or at least have a much greatly reduced risk of pregnancy. And so this really, once again, this kind of fits with the Roaring Twenties and the kind of party life that becomes common in the speakeasies, the places where people bought liquor. Now, at the national level, the government also, really worked hand in hand with big business. First, you have the Harding administration. You have the Coolidge administration. You have Warren Harding. And then you have Herbert Hoover. These are the three presidents that are in office during the 1920s. They're all Republican. And they are all big business people. They very much work with business. Now, the flip side of the 1920s is that you have government supporting business, and what these business-friendly administrations do is that they really reduce government regulation. And one of the things that we see happening is that government it reduces regulations on banks, and government really allows banks to sell stock market shares. I mean, it really allows banks to invest in stock market shares. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see why banks investing in stock market shares is a really bad idea. Because, banks get their money, of course, from people who deposit in banks. And, traditionally the way banks work is that banks make a profit by taking the money that's put into banks and using that money for loans. And usually these loans are for things where you have, tangible assets, something that is liquid, something that can be liquidated. I mean, like, for instance, a home loan. I mean, if you don't pay for your home, the bank takes it and sells it to somebody else. Automobile loans. If you don't pay for your car, the bank takes your car and sells it to somebody else. A business loan. If your business fails, the bank takes your building. The bank will take the property that you bought with the money, and they will sell it. The bank's going to get the money. You may make money or you may not make money, but the bank's going to get its money. Now, that model does not work if the bank invests in the stock market. I mean, as long as stocks are going up, and during most of the 1920s, stocks were going straight up. They made a lot of money. But, you know, by the time you get to Black Friday at the end of October in 1929, all of a sudden, within a day or so, the stock market loses $10 billion. Now, that $10 billion in 1929 is probably more like about $500 billion today. And you can imagine if the economy loses that much money in one day, that sets off a domino of economic devastation. But that was available. But that was possible because a very pro-business government did not really regulate things. And so that's the situation that the last president of the 1920s, Herbert Hoover, finds himself in. And we'll pick up with that on my next lecture.